Hey friends, welcome back to the Sinai to Zion study. This is now session 9. Again, to reiterate, what we've been doing is we have been tracing and identifying the primary themes throughout the Exodus narrative that clearly fall under the heading of a romance. And of course, the romance ultimately, as we've said, leads to a betrothal or a marriage covenant between God and Israel at the base of Mount Sinai. So here's Israel. They're now standing on the eastern side at the base of Mount Sinai, and the covenant begins. So the next major theme that we see within the Exodus narrative is what is referred to in modern Jewish weddings as well as ancient Jewish weddings as the ketubah. Okay, the ketubah, of course, is a Hebrew word, and the ketubah refers to a very legal document. Okay, and it's actually signed by both the bride and the groom, as well as in modern times the rabbi. Now, in the Western world, when I got married here in the United States, we had something called the marriage certificate. Okay, the marriage certificate was signed by myself and my wife, as well as the minister that married us, and it itself is also a legal document. But most oftentimes in Jewish weddings, what they'll do is they'll actually take their wedding vows, the things that they promise to one another, and they'll print them on a beautiful, after the style of an illuminated manuscript or piece of art. And there is all of their wedding vows, and then again, it will be signed by the bride, by the groom, and by the rabbi. I've actually included a few pictures here. Again, you could just Google ketubah and see all sorts of pictures. Here's a picture of the bride and groom signing their ketubah, and you can see it's framed. They'll actually hang it in their house after they get married. And here's the rabbi. I actually think this is an incredibly beautiful tradition, to actually take your wedding vows, your marriage vows, and print them on a piece of art. Here's another picture. I mean, there's actually businesses that will create these beautiful pieces of art. This is sort of a close-up of the ketubah, and if you look closely, you can see the room for the signatures at the bottom, and there it is. It's always going to be present in the house, hanging on the wall for everyone to see. Now, as that relates to the covenant that was made at Sinai, what we need to understand is this, is that Torah itself, the law itself, all of the commandments, the instructions, all of the details that Israel agrees to, these are essentially within the story, these are the wedding vows. And this is so important because, again, as I've said, on one side of the evangelical spectrum, you have those that really just view the law almost entirely negatively. You know, it's the old covenant, it's passing away, the new covenant is superior, I'm not under the old covenant, and this type of thing. And they'll quote various statements that Paul makes, or even in the book of Hebrews and so forth, that can be interpreted negatively. And those are almost exclusively the statements that will often be quoted. And there's a lot of other statements in the New Testament concerning the law that are very positive, that say it's a thing of beauty, that says it's a thing of beauty. Of course, Paul the Apostle would never have looked to Torah as a bad thing or a negative thing. Now, again, within the body of Christ, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have a real rise in these Hebrew roots movements, which say that everyone is obligated to keep Torah, every little detail, kosher, Sabbath, the feast, like all of the details, and if you don't, you're in sin, and this type of thing. I myself am really somewhere in the middle. I don't believe it's incumbent upon Gentiles to be Torah observant. I think the book of Acts makes this very clear, the first council of Jerusalem, so to speak. On the other hand, I don't think Torah should be viewed negatively. I think it should be viewed as a thing of beauty. And so here in the story, this is where we get this picture. I mean, if the Torah itself, if the commandments themselves are intended to be seen as the wedding vows, then shouldn't they be seen as a thing of beauty, something that would be hung on the wall, something that would be celebrated, right? You know, in modern times, modern Christian weddings or just secular weddings oftentimes, they can tend to be very sort of emotional. It's just, you know, I promise to always be your rock and the anchor in the storm and to stand by your side and, you know, these type of things. Within ancient Jewish tradition, it was very much a legally binding contract You know, it was like, I agree to pick up my dirty clothes off of the floor. And if I don't, here are the ramifications. And you're actually legally obligated to obey all of these things. So there's a bit of a difference, but there are certainly some very clear parallels. Now I'm going to go ahead and read Exodus 24, verse 3. And this is where you can clearly see the reference to this, to the Torah itself being the ketubah. And then there's a very special statement afterwards. So Exodus 24, verse 3, then Moses came, and he recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. Okay, so there it is. There's the wedding vows. In the midst of this covenant being made, Moses comes and he recites all of Torah, I mean, which is a lot, all of the ordinances, and then here it is. And this is different, by the way, than the original sort of proposal, where Israel says, yes, we will obey. Like, we don't know what we're getting into, but we say yes. And here, all of the details are actually read aloud, and then it says this, and all the people answered with one voice, and they said, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. So in a modern wedding, after the marriage vows are read aloud, the bride and the bridegroom both say, I do. I do. And there's kind of a legally binding covenantal nature to that. I do. And what's beautiful here is, even in Exodus 24, verse 3, we see the wedding vows, we see the ketubah, and then we see the people, all with one voice say, I do. Now, as the covenant continues, you have this statement that no covenant is made without the shedding of blood. Okay, now the covenant has been made. The agreement, this bilateral agreement between God and Israel has been made, and then you have the sealing of the covenant. You have the shedding of blood. Exodus 24, verse 4. Then Moses arose early in the morning, and he built an altar at the foot of the mountain. So he builds an altar right on the eastern side, the foot of the mountain. And then it says this, with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, elsewhere, the Lord commanded Moses to make this altar, and he specifically said, make the altar out of stones that are not cut. None of the stones are cut. They're just stacked. He gathers stones of the appropriate size, and he makes an altar. And then next to it, it says there's 12 pillars, which represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Then verse 6. Then he sent young men from the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings, and they sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. So now they start sacrificing a whole bunch of bulls, shedding of blood. Moses took half of the blood, and he put it in basins or buckets, and he took the other half, and he sprinkled it on the altar. As we see later, it says that Moses actually sprinkled the blood on the people. We'll actually read that. Okay, so as with any covenant, with the Abrahamic covenant, the Lord had Abraham cut up a full bull, a ram, a goat, and killed a couple of birds. There was shedding of blood for the Abrahamic covenant. There's shedding of blood for the Mosaic covenant. Clearly, the shedding of blood for the new covenant. But here are all of these bulls being sacrificed. Now, I've included here a picture. This is, again, just something I pulled off of the internet. And what's interesting is this artist has never been to this particular mountain in Saudi Arabia that I believe is the real Mount Sinai. But just by reading the text, this is an artist's portrayal of Moses and the priest offering up the burnt offerings on the altar. Behind them, you can see the pillars. They're sort of portrayed as obelisks, which is much more of a sort of an Egyptian-style pillar. I won't get into all the details of that, why I don't believe they would have done it that way. But the point is, there's the artist's rendition. Now, here's some pictures of the real altar, the real mountain. And the first picture is from up above, looking down on the altar. Now, by the way, in Deuteronomy, it actually says that there is a river that flows down the mountain next to the altar. It says there's a river, and that's, of course, where Israel got their water when they were at the mountain itself. So here's a picture looking down. Now, just to the right of this sort of hockey stick, this angular-shaped structure, you can see the dry riverbed today. That's where the river is. It comes down the mountain, exactly as Deuteronomy describes. Now, this structure that you're looking at, it's roughly 25 meters long. Okay, roughly in the range, I'm going to say about 80 feet or so. Now, the reason that it turns at an angle is because it was, for all intents and purposes, intended for the purpose of slaughter, right? So you don't, when the cow is walking down this aisle, cows are smart. If they look ahead and see the other cows getting getting their throat slit, they're smart. They're going to be upset. So they don't actually see what's about to happen to them until they go around the corner. Now, at the bottom of this structure, you can actually see the altar itself. What's so cool about this is the Saudi Arabian government actually excavated a portion of the altar at the bottom back in the 90s. And what they discovered specifically was a layer of ash, charcoal, and organic matter, bone fragments and organic matter, exactly as you would expect to see if this was indeed an altar. Okay, so right at the base of the mountain, to this day, is this altar. Now, some close-up pictures of the rocks, and of course, the altar itself is made with rocks that are not cut. They're not cut, they're not chiseled in any way, they're just stacked. And it's not a living structure. It's clearly something else because these are very long corridors that angle up to the altar at the end, and there's really no windows or doors or anything like that. It's really just this long aisle. If it was a living structure, it would have doors and different things, and it wouldn't be this narrow, long corridor type of thing. Now, here's what's interesting. Right next to this altar, what else do we find? What do the scriptures say? If this is the real Mount Sinai, what should we expect to find? Well, here are, in fact, 12 pillars right next to the altar to this very day, still sitting there out in the desert. And you go, well, how in the world would that be the case? First of all, they don't get a tremendous amount of weather in this area. It's quite a dry area. It's not like they get tons of rain. There is some snow and precipitation and this sort of thing that comes there, but it's just way out in the middle of nowhere. You see, when you go to Israel today, everything has been built upon. You know, everything is a tell. You know, they'll say this is a street where Jesus walked, or, you know, during the Roman era. But there's been so much civilization that's been built upon it. A lot of it is, you know, 10 meters underground or this type of thing. Here, it's just sitting out in the middle of nowhere. And what's interesting is it's largely been forgotten. So it hasn't been this big pilgrimage destination. There hasn't been millions of visitors. There's some Bedouins that live out there, and they seem to be aware of what it is, but it's largely unmolested, and it's really beautiful. All of the evidence is right there. And then as we wrap up, I want to read the last two verses, verses 7 through 8, Exodus 24, verses 7 and 8. Then he, that's Moses, took the book of the covenant, and he read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Now, it's difficult here to know whether or not within the narrative, if Moses actually read it all over again, and they said, yes, we will do, or if this is simply a reiteration of what we already read earlier. And then it says, so Moses took the blood, and he sprinkled it on the people, and he said, behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Now again, a covenant is not made without blood. Now there are two elements here that we need to recognize. One, there had to be the shedding of blood, of innocent blood, for the covenant to be made, for the covenant to be sealed. But it's much more than this. It's if you break the covenant, the penalty is death. Okay, so in modern weddings, okay, as we're making the marriage vows, we say, until death do us part. Until death do us part. That's usually the last words that are spoken within the midst of the marriage vows, and then both say, I do. But it is a covenant unto death. In the same way, Torah itself, as the New Testament says, it reveals our sin. And if we break the law, if we break Torah, then the penalty is death. And of course, the only way to be cleansed from that penalty of death is through the blood of the innocent lamb. Of course, we'll get to that later. So that's all the time that we have for now. Look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, God bless and Maranatha.